the central planners imposed a fake pandemic. You know that story. People like Jeffrey Epstein, it's now public record, were involved as early as 2017 in setting up the scheme of this great pandemic for some investors to make a fortune, such as Bill Gates. Epstein and Bill Gates discussed, matter of public record, of how to get rid of the poor people. The centralization of power into fewer hands is not a good trend. Fascism was about the concentration of power. Communism was about the concentration of power. Any dictatorship wants to concentrate power. Now, what's the justification for this? They will come up with stories, but when you look at the politics, it's very clear. In our day and age and where we live, the politics is not convincing because actually the opposite should happen. We claim to be fans of democracy. That means equal rights for people, participation of people in the decision-making process, not one-way diktats from above by central planners. Now, the politics is clear. There's no justification for this, but they're selling it us on the economics. What about the economics? Well, the economics is also very clear. There's no justification for centralization, even in the economics. What is the economics? Well, in order to have both democracy and economic success and prosperity, we need decentralization. The principle of decentralization is also known as the principle of subsidiarity, officially subscribed to, where we are, by Brussels, but of course in reality ignored almost all the time, is about delegating power and decision-making, the actual decision-making, to the lowest possible level, wherever possible. And it's been shown any organization involving humans will be more successful if you follow that principle because it works. People on the ground, at the front line, whatever it may be, they can react quickly, they can make decisions. But so the decisions will be better, will be more effective, but also people will be motivated. That's why the Soviet Union didn't really work so well, because you had these crazy instructions which made no sense, but you still had to do it anyway. So this principle is well established. I wrote a paper on this, Subsidiarity as Secret of Success. And it's an HR journal, Employee Relations. It's open access, so have a look at it. So we have no political justification and no economic justification. And yet the central planners demand more power and more concentration of power into their hands. And it's pretty bad, I tell you. It's been going on for years. They want to control all transactions. Let's start with transactions. Since the 2014 e-invoicing directive and the regulation 910, the Commission has made law that there will have to be electronic identification in order to allow for the creation of EU digital identity wallets. And some countries have already implemented this. Hungary, of all countries, actually has moved ahead of others in implementing this. And that means that there's no more economic transaction freedom because as a company, you're not allowed to issue an invoice. If it's not through the system with specific software, which is part of the centralized control. And of course, that is the first step to then also intervene and, perhaps stop transactions, whatever you want. Once you have the infrastructure, you can use this power. But it's not just Europe. We see the same trends, just like in 2020, when suddenly everyone had the same very strange list of prescriptions that needed to be implemented. Japan already has a qualified issuer invoice registration system, and so on. So what is this? This is actually the fallback plan B route to impose digital ID and total digital control of all our transactions in case things don't work out so well with Plan A. So we have to be aware of that. Plan A is central bank digital currency that are programmable, the power to create and allocate new money, which would give this to the central bank and therefore also transfer fiscal powers, the only sort of remaining power in the hands of parliaments, which is one of the definitions of democracy, for parliaments to decide over budgets. Obviously, you know, we're not in the parliament here because that's not, you know, that's not a democratic parliament when you don't have those powers. But they want to take them away from those parliaments in Europe that have those powers. The central planners want to take that job. But it's the transactions, and here, of course, what is the programmability? Well, is the infrastructure being created? It could be anything. It could be climate change, carbon footprint. That could be the principle, but it can be other principles. You know, do you support the war? Are you on the right side with your opinion on whatever currently is, you know, countries we're making war on? It could be anything. It could be you're stepping outside a 15-minute city, and so your money perhaps shouldn't work. But it's not just transactions. It's also assets. And this gets pretty scary here, I think. The Bank for International Settlement, the central bank, originally created, like most central banks, as a privately owned institution, but extraterritorial, created the precedent for extraterritorial organization that is above countries, outside countries. So it's sort of in Switzerland, but it's not actually in Switzerland, in Basel. Has suggested that, well, we need to tokenize everything, all assets, and bank deposit, bank money, central bank money, as well as other assets. And there needs to be seamless integration of all this and programmability in one platform, we are told. So what are these other assets? It turns out we already have national organizations that are currently compiling asset registers. And you think, okay, that's financial assets. Perhaps add land. Well, you can add quite a lot. They want to add everything, natural assets, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the oceans, everything. Now, why is this? Tolstoy wrote a good piece on this when he criticized Economist for only having land, labor, capital in the production function. Why is the air not in there? The energy, the sun. Well, because they haven't figured out how to control access and charge for it. And that's what's happening with digital ID. They now are able to do this. And now they want to do it, as we hear from World Economic Forum agenda contributor Lindsay Hooper at Sustainability Institute in Cambridge. We need to bring nature onto the balance sheet, allocate a value to it, and bring it into the accounting and financial mechanism. Well, and of course, there's various agencies in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in many countries already doing this for nature, and they're digitalizing it now. A natural capital register, the value, the quantity, and the quality of natural resources in one place. Now, this agency in the UK says, well, there's some critics that suggest, oh, we're trying to put a price tag on nature. It's important to understand that this is not the intention of natural capital accounts. Of course not. Because the intention is to control access to nature and charge for it. And they themselves go on, well, actually, what we're going to do is put monetary terms to nature, calculating where possible monetary value to the benefits produced by natural assets, and this will support, they say, prioritization. In other words, some people will get access, others not, and the criteria, well, they can be made up. Europe, the EU, is creating the Anti-Money Laundering Authority, AMLA, under a lot of secrecy and not exactly very transparent itself. And of course, this asset register will then have all sorts of assets in it. And of course, we then have as a next step the tokenization of these assets. And why is that important? In Switzerland, they're building the European Digital Asset Exchange. There will be other asset exchanges. Well, tokens can be useful to the extent that they facilitate the process of issuing, storing, and transferring value. So access can be programmed, not just on transactions, but also access to assets, including natural assets and the air we breathe. And ownership of these tokenized assets can be transferred from you to the central planners. That seems to be the agenda. So why aren't they rolling this out faster? Well, McKinsey in its study said, oh, there's some obstacles. Technical challenges, you know, for example, internet connections, things like that. Secondly, a clear or substantiated market value proposition has yet to be documented. In other words, there is no actual benefit of this for ordinary people. Some consider CBDC benefits to be limited relative to already established private solutions. We have digital money, it works. And thirdly, I'm still quoting McKinsey, trust remains a hurdle for a meaningful share of citizens and system participants to accept this, who question the motives behind CBDCs, often suspecting governments of aiming to monitor or restrict financial activities. Of course, we now realize it's not just financial activities, it's about all activities, and the programmability is a key feature. The Bank of England asked the government, the politicians in the UK, to give them the power to have programmable digital currency, and that is a control tool. The pilot CBDC projects that are ongoing, for example, this one in Brazil in particular, experts have already found out, yes, it has all those features. You can freeze transactions, you can take people's money away, you can intervene in those ways. Now, the central planners claim we will not abuse the limitless power that digital ID and CBDCs will give us. Okay. Well, should we trust them? Well, I can be brief here. I think all of you know examples of how this sort of power has already been abused. Just thinking of Justin Trudeau's ending the peaceful demonstrations by truckers in Ottawa. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their ability to buy food is how they got them. Too few used cash and digital currency. Well, they didn't have CBDCs, so they had to pass laws to do it, and that will be very easy once you have CBDCs. The police froze 206 financial products, including bank and corporate accounts, disclosed 56 entities associated with vehicles, facial recognition, even 253 Bitcoin addresses were identified, and PayPal was also shut down. So that's how they can do it. Now, interestingly, no such financial controls had been used previously to stop criminals. But, of course, peaceful demonstrating citizens, that's when it seems the central planners get pretty creative about how to stop people. And of course, we all know what happened in 2020. Digital ID suddenly were a topic. Vaccination passports as a backdoor to introduce digital ID. And then, of course, programmability. You can close access if you don't do X, Y, Z. And it can be anything the government central planners decide. And now we have the EU commissars already abusing their dictatorial powers that they've had for a while, but now they're showing these powers by declaring polite, very polite, considered critics like Jacques Beau, a Swiss former sort of army officer, in his, just giving his opinions. He's an outlaw now. He's been sanctioned. He can't buy food. He can't leave the country, Belgium, in order to travel back to Switzerland. It is quite extraordinary. Now, on the monetary front, the CBDC is the biggest upheaval in our monetary system in more than 300 years. But the digital aspect is not new. What is happening, therefore, is the centralization, but it's a particular type of centralization. The central banks are ripping up the old agreement between the banks and the central banks, which was that the central banks deal with banks and the banks deal with us. And overall, the banks haven't really abused that. They've never sold our data, ever, our transactions data. They haven't. That's really why they've become the enemy, because that's supposed to be a currency that they want to sell and trade, and banks have refused to do that. So the central banks are now stepping into the arena and want to compete against their regulated, the banks. This is like playing football. The umpire saying, well, it's a bit boring. I'm going to join. I'm going to score some goals, but I'll still reserve the right to blow the whistle, give the red card, give the yellow card. Who's going to win that game? So the bank regulators will compete against the banks, because CBDC is just a current account at the central bank. That's what's happening. Of course, this conflict of interest explains what the central banks have been doing. They've been taking anti-bank policies for many decades. Already in 2002, I warned about how the central banks were creating these asset bubbles, banking crises, recessions. And of course, that has continued ever since. Unabated, we've got regulatory moral hazard. The more crises they create, the more powers we give them. Each time they demand, oh, it's because we didn't have enough powers, which is not actually true and should have been stopped earlier. So can we trust the central banks to give them yet more power? I think the answer should be a resounding no. The high inflation that started in 21 was created by the central banks. No matter what they tell you about wars, the economics is very clear. I could forecast it quite successfully from May 2020 onwards, that 18 months later we'll get significant inflation because the money creation was just massive, off the charts. Then the central bankers imposed a fake pandemic. You know that story. And we know that people like Jeffrey Epstein, is now public record, were involved as early as 2017 in setting up the scheme of this great pandemic for some investors to make a fortune, such as Bill Gates. And then we can also make money injecting people with stuff and solve the problem, as Epstein and Bill Gates discussed, matter of public record, of how to get rid of the poor people. And of course, it was used at the same time to push digital